Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bootcamp. In today's session, we'll be doing an introduction to component-driven development, and we start working with Storybook. And then over the next class, we'll also start looking at bit.dev and seeing how all of this works together with React.
Okay, now let's get started. Just to get an idea about what we are trying to do. The thing is that when you have only one or two developers, it's not an issue. In Pana Cloud, we are mostly have a lot of developers. Daniyal, the problem is how to distribute work. And it is the problem faced by all medium to large companies. We are not a large company. We are comparatively not a very small company. But the point is, if there are 10 developers on a project, how do they divide work? The good thing is, with microservices and serverless, the server side has become very easy because to divide work, because by definition, the services are separated from each other. On the client side, in React, the components were there, but in order to basically use them or build them, what you had to do was log into a single repository and everybody pushing code to that. And anybody who has developed in an agile way, very fast way, able to deliver to the client, it becomes a huge problem because you are always afraid that the junior developers is going to disrupt something. Of course, you can roll back, but the problem is that in rollback it creates a lot of disruption, and the clients don't like it, and of course you dislike it.
Yes.
And you become confused. So, Adil, why don't you start off? How do we do? What is component-based development?
Yeah. So if you look at how UIs are developed, normally, if we just go into developing a UI, it has been developed as a page oriented. So you would go and you would start with the page and you'd build the layout, and then you would go and build out the individual components. So it's more of a top down approach that has been done traditionally. But with component driven development, what's being done is to build from the bottom up. So it's a difference between design and development. So with component driven development, it doesn't mean that you design from the bottom up. You can still design from the page layout kind of view. But when you go and develop the actual UI, it's better to break down the overall application into smaller pieces, smaller components, and then build those components in independent, isolated environments, and then you can integrate them together in a page layout kind of thing. So with our bootcamp, I put together some slides as well, so I'll get that here. So you can have a more driven. Can you see it? So yeah, so if you look at a definition of it, it means designing software apps by building loosely coupled and independent components. So
Before we get started,
yeah,
Adil, we are getting a little bit echo. So therefore, anybody who's not talking, please mute your mics.
I think it's better now. Yeah. Okay. So with component driven development, we mean building a software application by building its components independently and making sure that they're loosely coupled. So instead of having tightly coupled or like a monolith kind of UI, we're building a independent components and then integrating them. Because the UI is basically one massive system integration kind of job. If you look at all of them and try to code it everything together, it's a nightmare. So this way, if you break it down, it becomes much easier to manage, and you're able to do it a lot faster. So component driven development is a all-encompassing concept, and within it you have it applies to everything, so including how the design systems work. If you have pattern libraries, it applies heavily with JavaScript frameworks, and specifically with React. um, and similar to how Zia you had mentioned with microservices that were working in the back end to make it easier to write them and enable scalability and efficiency. Similarly, component-driven development does a similar kind of thing on the UI side, where you can develop the components independently and spread that work across teams. So, what are some of the advantages of component-driven development? Organizations can use it to achieve their goals, and simultaneously doing so, they can have faster web development. They can make sure that their apps are more scalable and more efficient. And it's done with a few different things. So, one, you have autonomous teams. So, as you had mentioned earlier, that you have a team working on some product, and what I've seen a lot of the startups and even the bigger companies now, they try to have smaller, more focused teams instead of having a huge team that's working on everything. So you'll have a team of maybe maximum of 10 people, and they'll be working on one targeted, focused feature or product. And then you'll have separate teams that are working in parallel, and all of their work is combined and integrated at some further stage. Uh, so with component-driven development, teams have a lot of autonomy, and they're able to work on features or products independently, and they have a lot of control and say over how they're going to be working. Um, Also, they have their own code bases. So a team can be autonomous because it has its own code base, and it's separate from other teams. So without having a lot of overlap with other teams and what they're doing, you have access to your own environment where you're able to code the components, and not be hindered by what other teams are doing. Because if you're all working in a single code base in a single environment, there's going to be a lot of issues, and it's just going to waste a lot of time. Um, Component driven development also gives us the ability to have incremental upgrades. And this is basically easy to do because you'll have components that are there, they're independent, and you can deploy them at a time of your choosing, right? So you can have smaller releases and incremental upgrades to the overall application. And because it's all the coding is done in such a modularized way, the releases are done much faster. So instead of having a single release in maybe a month or 2 months, you can have it release maybe every day if you're working on a single component. So you're able to push to your Git repository continuously, without having a lot of impact on other components because you're isolated. In terms of the application itself, what does component-driven development do? One, it makes the development work a lot faster because, again, if you break down the work into smaller components, you're able to focus more on exactly what you're trying to achieve. So the UI component has lesser work as compared to the entire application. So you're able to focus on what you need to build for that component alone. And you'll have, if you need some APIs, you'll have narrow focus APIs instead of having some massive API that you need to build to ensure everything has access to it. So this way, the overall development time is much faster, and as well as the testing time, because you're not only able to build the smaller component faster, you're able to test it faster as well. Because the components are small pieces of code, modifying them, updating them, basically the overall maintenance of the component code is easier, as compared to having to refactor uh, code inside of a much larger code base. And because these are independent components, again, you can reuse them, and you could even extend them to be used in other applications instead of having to rewrite the same code again and again. We had focused earlier in the bootcamp on test-driven development. It ties into component-driven development here very well, because if you're writing tests for the entire application, it kind of gets tedious, and people don't like to write a lot of tests. But if you're focused on a single component, you can have more valid testing, and you'll have a much better test-driven development, because you'll be isolated in your own environment. You can write this test for this specific component. You can write the component, and it all comes together nicely. Some small projects here, but if you have a larger application, I saw somewhere Facebook has more than 50,000 different components in their UI. So think of it like you would have to learn all of that code before you could even get started on working. But if they're breaking down into code, into components, you're able to work on a single component without having to worry about what all the other components are doing, and you can start working on the first day even. Because some of the projects I've worked on, it takes a while to learn exactly what's going on before you can even think about touching the code. But if you've made it in components, you can you can get assigned a single component. You can learn it pretty quickly, and you can start working on it. You can start maintaining it, improving it, and so on. And because everything is now broken into these components, it's easier to design the overall application. It's easier to understand it because you can see how all the different pieces come together, and you can work on it easier because you can assign teams and different developers on different components and have them all come together. So what is component-driven development? If you look at it in more detail, if you look at a website, it's an interface, and within the interface, there's a bunch of repeating components and patterns. And when I say this, like for example, even if you look at a simple application, you'll have a simple example of a pattern that repeats itself is maybe a button. So, like for example, if you go to Facebook, you'll see the similar pattern of a button. You'll throughout the entire application, even though there are so many different components, they're all using a similar pattern. So what happens is, from an entire organizational perspective, from the designers, from the developers, to all the stakeholders, they benefit from this because the design becomes easier, development becomes easier because you can reuse and scale the components. And from a user perspective, they have a more familiarity with the interface, and they're able to understand the app better. Think of it like if you went to the homepage of Facebook, you saw a particular design and it has a different color theme. And then if you redirect to some other page on Facebook and imagine like all the UI was completely different, you would need some time to adjust to the environment, and then be comfortable in making more decisions as a user on that page. So the overall design from this perspective helps, because if you're reusing a standardized design pattern through your entire application, it helps it helps all the different stakeholders in the app. And so we read this definition before, that CDD is designing software apps by building loosely coupled independent components, right? So instead of looking at all the components together as one big piece, as we used to, now think of it as separate independent components that are loosely coupled. And then you can focus on that single component that you're working on at a time, and you can pay more attention to it, and you can work on it faster and get it done. So what is a component? We've worked with components inside of React, but it could be a bunch of different things. It's basically a well-defined independent user interface. And inside of it, you can have maybe a simple button could be a component. A heading could be a component. You could have a call to action. You could have some navigation. You could have headers, footers. All of these are separate independent user interfaces that could be reused anywhere in your application. Um, so a lot of components are available to us as HTML5 elements that we are able to style globally with CSS. And in more traditional development, what you could have done is have the HTML element, and then you would have a CSS class to style it a certain way. And then if you needed a different instance of that HTML element, maybe a button with a different color, you would have another class with a different layout, a different interface. Um, but then you switch into more modern JS frameworks like with React. What we can do now is have components that are styled based on property attributes. So something like this, where if you've seen, we've used Material UI and other UI libraries with React. So we're able to have a button element and pass in some um, theme, some value for the theme property, and have it appear in a certain way. So you'll have, with Material UI, we have primary and secondary themes and so on. Then there's this concept of atomic design. So with atomic design, what we're looking at now is uh, interfaces as a whole, and then you dissect them into components of different sizes. So with component-driven development, we're doing bottom-up, and then atomic design is taking the entire interface as a whole and then dissecting them. Um, with atomic design, you have some standardized language for creating that hierarchy. So at the top level, you have pages, and then within pages, you have templates, organisms, molecules, and atoms. So the atoms is what uh, is used for the terminology atomic design. So if you look at this, if you can work forward or backward. So if you start with Atom, you're working more on a component-driven development. If you're coming from the pages, this is you take the overall interface and you break it down from the page to the template, and then an organism which has multiple uh, of these molecules, and then within it you'll have some very small level components. So we can combine both of these concepts and create a workflow and a process uh, in which we can take benefits of both of these methodologies coming together. So from the atomic design, we can have a universal language. It makes communication easier from developers and designers. So because designer will be talking from the page perspective, and the developer, if it's a component driven development methodology, will be talking about the individual component. So you'll need some common vocabulary so you can communicate more effectively. And then with the CDD, you have the precision and the focus on an individual component as a developer. So you can focus on that and get it done and deliver the component. React supports CDD, and it allows us, as we've seen, we are able to create components within React, and we can create them separately, and those come together in our pages and come up, and that's how we can come up with the entire user interface. And what we can do in React, if we're following a CDD approach, is we can develop components, and before we integrate them into the overall UI, we can design and develop them with some placeholder text from some pattern library before we actually, and then once we've perfected the component as is required, then when we import the component to our actual UI with where everything is integrated, that's where we can get the data and connected to whatever. Maybe it could be a content management system. Maybe you're accessing a API. Maybe some backend or some database. So this is content-driven development, and now we can talk about some of the tools that we have to make this approach easier for us. So one of them is Bit, which is a component-driven platform. So with Bit, you are able to have more speed, scale, and efficiency. So as all tools, they help you in achieving some goals. So if our goal is CDD, Bit makes CDD easier for us to achieve as a team, as an organization. and it includes two key parts. The first is a open source tool, and then the second is a cloud platform. So the open source set of tools provided by Bit allows us to build isolated components. So instead of building our components um, in the in a team space, in the overall project space, we get an isolated environment where we can build the components, where we can resolve dependencies, where we can compose components into apps, and we can control the build process independently from the rest of the organization. And once we have it at a point, then we can version the components, and we can publish components separately and independently into its cloud platform. So the cloud platform is basically like an online library where you have published components from other developers. You're able to share your own components. You're able to discover other developers' components. You're able to install your components into an application, and this is an easy way to reuse code and share and collaborate. Some of the advantages of using Bit. So number one, to make the web development process faster. So with these tools, you're able to develop faster and reach market more quickly, because you're able to develop in isolated environments and then integrate components into the apps. And you're able to reuse your component in other places in your app, or maybe in other applications. And then you have standardization. So with Bit, you have the ability to customize each component, and then create automated workflows to define the way that they're developed, tested, and how they're documented for all the different teams across different applications. And we talked about with CDD the autonomous teams, and they need a lot of self. They need a lot of autonomy to be able to make decisions. So with Bit, you're able to have a team structure that gives ownership of the product of the component, from all different stages, from development to production. The team is able to decide what it's doing, how it's developing it, given the framework that's been set in Bit. So they can develop them independently in their own code base. They can release the work that they're doing, and they can integrate the components with each other into the applications. Um, yeah, so with Bit, you have a decoupled code base that's scalable. So because each team is working in its own code base, they're isolated from another team. So if I have a team, I'm working on my code. It's my own code base that has nothing to do with maybe Zeeshan and Daniyal's code base. So we all have different code bases, and we're able to build independently of each other. Maybe I make a mistake, and if we had one code base, that would have become a big problem for Daniyal and Zeeshan. But because now we have separate code bases here, what I'm doing doesn't really affect them. They're able to work independently of me. I'm able to uh, get my work done, and then all of this can maybe once I push my code and once it's released to the Bit cloud, then they could reuse my code, or maybe I could reuse their code at that point. And this separation is how you're able to compare this kind of to the microservices. So you're able to scale your applications this way. Because the development is broken down into components, you're able to develop with a more focused approach, as we've mentioned a few times. Um, this what happens as a result is you are able to develop faster and release more code to production. So you've seen with CDD, you have up to 30 times more releases to production by product teams. So it's a lot of it's a huge improvement in productivity and how quickly and how frequently we're able to release work to production. And with CDD, you're able to do incremental upgrades. So because the components are again independent, you can have different teams working on separate components, and you can deploy each component as it gets done. in incremental upgrades to your overall application, right? So what Bit does is, instead of making changes to an entire monolith UI, it runs on something that's called the component dependency graph, and it applies to all the applications that are using that component. And then you have the structuring innovation. So with CDD, we have, if you look at more innovative companies or more innovative teams, they're smaller teams that need the ability to make decisions quickly and continuously. So with this approach, the teams are able to deliver results and a lot more insights than compared to a larger team or a larger organization that there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. So you're able to have these frameworks and tools to help as a small team to get results faster. And because they're components, they're able to be reused, and they're able to be shared by other apps, by other developers into their own apps. Um, yes. So because we've isolated all these components into their own code, and then you can integrate them. If something breaks in one component, for example, it doesn't break the rest of the application. It would just break that component. So this way you could, to go and fix it, instead of having to look at an entire application, you can just look at that particular component and figure out, debug what's the issue, and then you can make the change. You could replace the component, or maybe you can simply just fix the issue. Um, yes, and there's always some sort of acceptance criteria that uh, your software application or your code needs to meet before being able to be deployed to production. So with Bit, you have an automated pipeline for build and test requirements. So if you build a component that doesn't pass your acceptance criteria, it simply will not be able to be promoted to production. So it helps you with this automated pipeline to, once you've built it and tested it, everything has to be passed according to your organization's acceptance criteria before being actually allowed to be deployed to production, which would eliminate a lot of issues from the production environment itself. And with all of this, with this methodology, there's a lot of time that's saved, a lot of resources that's saved, and a lot of cost, a lot of money is saved from the web development activities, because you're able to reduce the time developers are spending writing duplicated code in the organization. You're able to speed up how quickly you're able to build new features, how quickly you're able to maintain or change or fix issues inside of components, and get rid of a lot of tools and resources that are used by legacy systems and legacy issues. And then moving on to some another tool for CDD is Storybook. We'll be using this tool. We'll start looking at later today. Zeeshan will go more in depth. But at a high level, Storybook is a rapid development environment for UI components. And what it does is it gives you a component library where you can view different states of each component. So Storybook manages these stories, which are basically JavaScript functions, and each story is a function, and then you can have different states of that story. And then you're able to interactively develop and test these components inside of Storybook. And all of this is done in complete isolation from the rest of your application. And there's another tool called React Styleguidist, and this is another component development environment. It gives you a hard reloaded dev server with a living style guide, and it's based on prop styles, and it gives you access to editable usage examples. And this works with Create React App, and it supports ES6 and TypeScript. In comparison, if you compare the two, Storybook and React Styleguidist, Storybook is based on stories written in JavaScript, and then Styleguidist is based on examples in Markdown files. And whereas Storybook gives you one variation of a component at a time, Styleguidist can give you multiple variations of different components. And then Storybook is more suited towards having different component states, whereas Styleguidist is used for documentation and giving demos of a component. So we'll be using Storybook with React, and Storybook allows us to create React components. And so what we can do is import React into the Storybook file, and then the Storybook environment can either exist on its own independently in its own Git repository, or you could have Storybook within the React project repository. And then I think it'll be better to separate the two and have the Storybook environment in its own repository, maybe, and then the React project separately. Um, so if we look at a recap, the benefits of CDD for development teams, you have faster development, you have more code reuse, you're able to do better test-driven development. There's a more unified and consistent design system. Because maybe components have been pre-built, you'll have access to the cloud library of components with the bit.dev cloud, and then you'll be able to collaborate on changes to components rather than rewriting components and reduce the amount of code. You'll have less code to maintain because you can reuse existing code. You'll have the ability to focus more on building new things rather than continuing to reinvent the wheel all the time. And then you have the standardized and consistent development methodology. And that's an intro to component-driven development.
Thank you so much, Adil. Zeeshan, let's start with the first Storybook and then Bit. First, Zeeshan will cover Storybook, and then Daniyal, if time is left today, will start working on Bit. Most probably, we'll go to the next class for Bit. Zeeshan.
Sure. So let me share my screen first. So the Storybook, just a moment. Basically, Adil has explained in much detail about the component-driven development and how we use. The great benefit of component-driven development is you can create application or component that are independent of your overall application, and you can develop them independently, and then you can plug these components into your application. Storybook provides you the much easier way to view your component in a separate in different state. So what you need to do is you need to create an application which has too many of components. When you are working on an application or a large application, what you need to do is two things are very important in such UI. First one is the theme, the overall application, the component. Let's say the common example is a button of in an application. Button needs to be consistent in your whole application. So if it's in a button that needs to be stay same and similar in all the pages or whatever component you create, so you need to have a button which should be a consistent, and you create a separate component for that, and then you can use it in your whole application. Similarly, there can be multiple things which you develop as a component and then you can use in your application. So what happened is you can use that component separately. At this moment in a Storybook, we'll be using within a project, but with the Bit, which Daniyal is going to cover, we can do deploy, and we can import and install these components separately. So we'll start with the Storybook. The thing we need to understand is once I need to develop something, I need to have a page, and then I need to have a proper place of that particular component so I can see if this component is working fine or not. Storybooks helps you create component directly. You create a component and you can view different states of a component. Then you can easily add your component into your application. So it gives you a lot of benefit, and all those who are great proponent of object-oriented programming will love this idea, because the way we learn object-oriented programming, it's always a separation of concern and separate objects that these objects communicate with each other. So that's a very important part of component-driven development. So for that, we go to the storybook, main storybook page. It gives you a lot of detail. In getting started, it will give you the idea how you need to start, how you need to install this initial as this what you say article or this guide missed the one thing, which is you need to set up an application and then you need to install it. So for that, the article also given, which we follow to for the development of application with the storybook. This article gives you much better view of how you start working with the storybook and application. The problem is the current version of 6 has some problems which is causing a problem. So let me show you first how you will start your application, how you set up your application, and then I'll show you what the workaround at this moment we have. So first of all, what we are going to do is to work with the storybook. What storybook does is it gives you another view inside your application, so you can see components separately, separate from your application. So what we are going to do is npx create react app, which we have done uh, quite a lot of time. Then in your application folder, what you need to do is you need to run a command npx p storybook / cli sb init. So basically, Storybook CLI is a global, needs to be installed globally, and then whenever you want to install it, you will call it npx sb init. So what it will does is it will add a Storybook feature inside your React application. npx sb init will add a Storybook feature into your application. So first, we need to have this. Now, once you try create a React component, React application, and then you install this, what it will do is it will install Storybook 6.0.21, I guess. At this moment, there are a lot of errors, and I have explored the GitHub for the Storybook, and there are a few errors. So what I did is I moved to the previous version of 5. But let me show you, if you run these commands, what output you will have in your React application. You will have a folder which is hidden folder. It has a main.js, preview.js, so .storybook, a folder. I'll explain this folder. In package.json, you will have few dev dependencies. Bevel core, storybook add-on action, storybook essential, link, local, preset, storybook react. Why we need this, I'll explain in a bit. So these dependencies will be added if you when you call npx sp init and 2 of the storybook commands, so that you can start a storybook. I'll show you all these things. In src folder, what we will have is we have story folder. Inside that story, this is what the initial project structure will be when you start with the npm what you say create react app, and then you use npx sbinit. So it is done by all these commands. It gives you a basic button component and its story. All these things are already there. So this is how you will get the project structure initially, so you can cope up with it. But the problem is, at this moment, the version 6 is causing a quite lot of problem. So the example which we are following in this article has given the complete application link at the end of the article. So what I'll do is I'll pick the dependencies from this article. In this article, this The same structure, only difference is its package.json has dependencies of version 5. We need to explore the errors, but at this moment we don't need to worry about because our application will work fine with dev 5 dependencies. So what I'll do is I have created a React application, and I will not run the command which is Storybook shell. I'll not run this command because it will, whatever I'll do, it will install version 6 and all the dependencies will be for version 6. So I have to do it manually at this moment. Once we'll find the solution, then we can do it directly, and it will give you all the structure and all things directly. So let me pick these dependencies from here, or I guess I have already done it in package.json. Yes, I already pasted it over here. I have just created the application. Just a moment. So what I did is npx create app and the name of your application. Once I've done with that, I'll not run the another command, and what I'll do is I'll go to the package.json. There will be no such thing. So I'll add these commands: storybook action, no link. I'll one of the add-ons later. So we need these dependencies so that your application can work with the storybook. One, you need a folder dot storybook. Inside that folder, we'll create main.js file. Uh, Go for the application and need to develop a counter application as we have did with the React. So in counter application, we need which will have two buttons, increment, and it will increase and decrease the value. So what generally folder I'll add, let's say, counter.js. In counter.js, at this moment, I'll just show you the
Zeeshan, Zeeshan, you are
yes.
being disrupted. Please reconnect.
I think it's the internet bandwidth, Zeeshan.
Okay, just a moment.
I think he is watching Netflix too much on, on another screen.
Just a moment. It's not easy to focus on Netflix and
Maybe he decided to watch Netflix and leave us.
Uh-huh.
He's coming.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, let's try again. Okay, so where was the problem? So I can repeat the content.
You have just created dot storybook,
Okay.
a hidden folder.
Okay, so after creating a storybook folder and inside that we need a main.js, I I'm moving towards
Can you
the
share your
non.
screen again?
Okay,
Your
just
screen.
start.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. So after creating a hidden folder .storybook and inside a file main.js, there is nothing else. I'm moving towards the normal way we create a component. So inside app.js, we have the empty div, and what I did is I have created component folder. Inside that component folder, I have created a counter.js component, and that it has nothing but just a hello counter. Now, what I can do is at this point to run to view a counter, what I need to do is in the app, I'll have to go and I have to write counter like that. I have to run this application. Let's say yarn start. What it will do is the way we have previously saw that it will show you the counter. So now if you want to multiple flavors of counter, if you want to see counter component or you have a multiple components, you need to view them. So Storybook provides you a component development with the ease that you can display your components separately separate from the pages, so you don't need to worry about putting them into the component putting into the pages or where you just can view create a component and view them. So instead of so this will run the application. What we need to do is we need to create open another command prompt, and inside that command prompt I need to run yarn storybook. But this is in command, so what we need to do is we need to have this command in package.json. As I have said, because we are doing it manually, so we have to pick those things from the uh, article or the project we have previously saw with that create your project, but it has a problem. So what I'll do is I'll pick these command storybook. So I'll run yarn storybook. It will actually run start storybook and it will go for the port number 06001 and the public folder. So it will run the storybook. So once I did this, what I'll have to do is I have to run yarn storybook. So what while this being loaded, what we need to do is we need to have some values in main.js. What we need to have is okay. So you can see at this moment the interface of a storybook on your local machine inside the same project. So that's your project. It has at this moment there is nothing related to storybook. There is no story. Main.js is empty. But when you start yarn storybook, it shows you this interface. All your component will display over here. So what we need to do is we need to pick the hidden folder storybook and we need to pick values from main.js. These lines you don't need to copy or you don't need to run these once the error will resolve with the version 6. At this moment, we need them. What it does is in Storybook main.js, it says where your stories are. So at this moment, we have not created a story, but definitely we need to have them in source folder, and there will be some folder, and your story should be ended with the story.js. Your application needs some add-ons. I'll explain knob add-on in a moment, but we need these add-ons. So that's done with the story, the configuration of a Storybook. We have done with the package JSON. Now what we need to do is we need to have a folder named stories. Inside that we need to have a file, whatever we need to name it, but what I'll do is counter dot stories.js. So .stories.js, why we need it? Because we have mentioned in main.js that pick the stories.js. So inside that story, what we need to have? We need to export a story. At this moment, we do not have. So what we'll do, export default. Here, I'll give him the title, counter, and it need a component. So I'll give it a component. Counter component which we have created here. So that's a normal component. The component will be a normal, but how you need to use it, how you want to create component should be an independent, and it all the properties or information required to the component should be passed from the external source. So we'll see that once we have this one. Let me go to the UI. There is nothing at this moment. Why? Because we have not created any story yet. What that is? So let me export function counter default, whatever name you can give it. Return. Now what we are trying to do is we are creating a component. At this moment, just empty counter. Now let's go back. So a story is different flavors of a component. So you create a component and you can display multiple style or different style of a component, so that whenever you want to view or you want to see what component is and how that component will behave, how that component will display. So you can see that component separately in a storybook, and you can use that component in your application wherever you want. So you don't need to create a page so that you can display your component, that will be directly available to you. So we have created a counter component. Have to change, don't need it. It's being loaded. React must be in scope. Okay. So as we are using JSX, so we need to have a React in our import. Now you can see in this interface, is provided by the Storybook, and what it does is you have a counter. What this counter is, you have created an export default as story. The title counter, this is the title, and counter default, this is your function which you have created for your counter. So what you are trying to do is you can create a component with the different flavors, a component with different versions. So let me create another one. Counter with value, let's say initial value 34. I've created initial value 34, and as we know, because we are providing this property, so we must need to have this property here. So as we have know, either we can use props like this, props dot initial value. Now you can see we have two versions. So what you can do is you can view different versions of a component, and you don't need to create a page. You have a multiple flavors. Like what I need to do is I need to have a background color for the counter component. So in this case, what I now, that's the important part. When you are creating a component, all those information that can be changed or that needs to be uh, depending on your application, or they need to be coming from the external source, should be coming from props, so that you can customize that component. So the component should be flexible enough so that it accepts values from external sources. So in prop, let's say I want to have what you say background color. So what I can do, I have two options. Either I will use style here, and what I'll do is background color colon props dot background color. So I'm assuming that someone will send the property background color to us in this component. In this case, at this moment we are creating a multiple flavor. So what I'll do is I'll create another flavor of counter. Here I will say I'll pass the background color property. Value will be, let's say, red. That will be quite bad, but okay. So that's another flavor, but it's not there. Props dot. Okay. Background. Let's check just a moment. Is not being applied over here. Okay, there might be some mistake of name, so it's corrected. Okay, so now I have another flavor with the color red. What I can do is I can create another version of component with so now we can see we have multiple version of a component and we can see different values. What we can do is at this, as we have discussed with the button, I need two button in my counter component so that I can create increment and decrement event. So what I'll do is I'll create a component instead of what we can do, we can easily add two buttons here, but those two buttons needs to have a similar values, and maybe in our application we need a button at multiple places. So what I'll do is I'll create a component button, and over here we'll create a button. The good part is we need two buttons. One will have a value of increment, another one will have a value of decrement. So here we will not provide static or hardcode value. We'll assume that we will receive props or title or message or value, whatever you need to give it. And once we click that button, it should have on click function. In this on click, at this moment will do nothing but just show alert hello. I'll explain it in a bit. So we have a button and we can use that button inside this component. That's the easy part. So title should be increment and it's simple. We have these two buttons, but as we have created a separate component with the name button, we should have a separate story for that so that we can view different style of a component if we want to create it. So what we need to do is we need to create another story, button dot stories .js, and inside that, similar to this counter, we need to export it. Button we will now we need stories, different flavors of a button. So that's default title hello. Okay. Now you can see we have another story named button and it has a default button. So instead of going into the page and displaying where that button will display, where that button will appear, how that button will work, we are directly displaying that button as component and we can use whatever we want. Let's say I want to style that button. So what I'll do is I will add a CSS file button.css, and in that file what I'll do is import um,
Zeeshan, this will allow you to develop catalogs of components for your
Yes,
application.
we can easily create too much. Let's say, for example, we mostly have our application have login and sign up component. So if we can create customized component of sign in sign up component, and we can use that component in anywhere in our application or in multiple application.
Therefore, what they will be doing is your component developers will be developing components, and you will be
Yes.
basically
Okay,
using them.
so button.css. Now what I can do is I can display class name, and here what I'll do is, let's say, and I need border radius to be, let's say, 10 px. So if we have a border radius 2 px, and if we apply this CSS, so instead of going into the page, we'll easily see these changes directly in component. So you can see that's our rounded button, and what I can do is, let's say, um, 16px, into 2px. Now in button component, what I can do is I can add large, but so that's the default value, but we can customize it, and I'll show you how we can customize it. So that's the real essence of creating a component. So at this moment, I have this component with the large CSS. Then I can change it, and that's a small. But I need to change the code. Instead of that, what I need to have is a customization so that this CSS applies or appears with some logic. So what I will do is I'll I'll be assuming that we will receive a property name size. All button. And we will receive a property name size small, large. Inside that button component, as we are assuming the size, so what I'll do is let me first change the CSS so it will stay consistent with the name, so it will be easy for me to manage. I'll change it small and large, and inside the button, what I will do is I'm assuming I will receive so in CSS what I can do is, instead of applying classes like this, I will create size. So the value inside that uh, property is small, it will directly go to the class name is a size, and we have a class name size here 16 and 22. So I just need to do one more thing. That's how you can apply multiple CSS classes with customized value. Okay, so now we have large and small. So you can see that's the default button, small and large. So you can see we can have multiple size of button with customization, and you don't need to do it separately. You can create different stories and you can customize your button. Now the click function, which whenever I click on this button, so the important part is we need to, as you can see, I have just changed this button because this component button is being used inside our counter component. So we have directly have these button and rounded button inside our component. So in counter, what I can do is I can say size equals to large, size equals to, just to show you, otherwise we wouldn't be be having two different size of button. So you can see now in button we are expecting, in counter we are expecting a click event. So we need something here. So we need to assume that we will be receiving a click function from our caller component. So let me, so I'm assuming I'll receive something, I'll do some action. What we can do is we have two options. Assuming that we will receive a function and pass that function directly, or we want to have some other function or some other action by ourselves, so we can call this function inside our function. So that's how you need to implement, that's your implementation, how you need to do this. So that's a two way you can use it. So at this moment I'm just using the different way, so calling my function and inside that props.onClick. So in this case that means I'll be providing a function into my component. So here in counter what I'll do is I'll pass onClick. Here it is expecting a function, and what that function will do, at this moment we have not any state function, so I'll show that in a moment. Okay, so we have these two components, and at this moment let's say if I have an alert, because we are not doing anything else at this moment, so just let me show the alert and then I'll update to the right status values. In button stories, now we can have another function, another story. Button with event. You can see it, it's it's not doing anything because we have not provided the click event over here. We have not provided the click event even here. We have provided the click event here. So inside button story, that's alert at this moment. So we are not going into the alert detail. In counter component, we have provided two alerts. So as we know, we need a value that needs to be increment. So what I'll do is const value comma set value. That's a normal component, so we can do use state, all these things, because that's our component. And in what we need to provide is the value should have initial value, which we have provided from anywhere. We will be receiving the initial value, hello counter component props initial value. So what I'll do is I'll provide this initial value, props dot initial value. and let me display value, and inside increment function, the click event of a button, what I'll do is I'll call set value. This example we have seen in much detail when we were working on our Redux example, so that's exactly same. Now you can see in counter component, that's normal for a component. We have created set value, we have provided the counter value. The difference is we have created separate components. Even the title, the size, and the click event are provided. Whoever calling that component, and to see how this component works, we should have a separate story, so that while creating a component, we can understand that what are the properties that need to be provided from the outside. So now with this, you can see it's calling the increment, decrement, and we have not created a separate app where we will be providing the counter component and all the function. It's all being done as a this, you can say, a multiple flavor of a component or a separate entity of a component, so you can use them easily. One important thing I also need to display. What you can do is, at this moment, what we are trying to do is the property, it's hard coded. So what I need to see different value of a component, so I can change these values. So there is an add-on name knob. Let's say this the article says it is creating a table, so you have a data, but you need to change it so that you can instead of changing all the time, going into the code and changing the data, you can update that data inside the interface of a Storybook, so you can live update your data. So for that, what we need to have is an add-on called a knob, and it's a decorator. What the decorator is, basically, decorator is what you say, it's kind of a wrapper. So whenever you need to do something, you need a additional information over it. So decorator decorates your component or whatever information you want. So all the time, it's a decorator is also pattern when you need to decorate something, so your component can have independent what you say, feasibility, usability, independent information, independent existence, but you can apply decorators over it so that they can have a different versions or different flavors. So in knob, it's working as a decorator, so your component will have, inside your story will have separate information so that you can customize it. That's only work for the stories at this moment. So you need to call yarn add, but in our case, that's already exists in our package JSON, so we don't need, because it's already exists. So there are multiple add-ons for action, for links, so we don't need to add that. What else we need to do is we need to add that add-on in main.js. That's also already exists, which we have created initially. So that add-on also exists over here. Now what we need to do is we need to import that with knob and object number, whatever information you need as an updated field. Decorators with knobs, what you can do is inside your component, you can your story, you can apply decorator. So let's go to the counter story, and what we need to do is we need to import with knob. It's better to copy. Okay, so decorators with no. Now, I don't need object at this moment because I have a simple value which is 34, 45. So I don't need object, I need number. So what I can do is inside that component, let's say that's our counter with initial value. So in initial value here, instead of directly providing 34 in a curly bracket, what I'll do is in curly bracket, I'll provide number, I'll name it initial value and a value of 34. What it will does is it will give you the now you can see here initial value is 34. It's an editable field. It does not appear here. It's not here. It's not here because we have provided the decorator only in a single story. So 34. What I can do is I can update it to 78. You can see 78. 45. 45. So we can work with this initial value and we can change this value. That's one example. Your component can have an object and you want to update that object. So you can have that object editable over here. So whenever you need, it's all because you can have a library of a component, you can have a multiple flavor of a component and you want to see different state of a component. So you want to change the value and you need to see if there is there's something happen with the different values. So you can use all those things together. Now creating a component and using it is similar as we have done or already done. The only difference is we are creating stories so that you can see different flavors of component, and because of that you can understand that whatever property requires component requires should be provided from the outside, so that component will stay independent and can be used anywhere in your application, and you can apply that in your application anywhere. That's how you can use your component, and you can customize your css for particular component, and then you can use it with the storyboard. I guess that's more of it. There are many things which we can use with the component storyboard, but the largely it's how you need to do is, let me just revise it. First of all, you need to install storyboard. So at this moment we are facing problems, so we'll using version 5. Then you need a storyboard folder if you are using the default in installation process, so it will be there from start, so you don't need to create it. But if you are using it manually, so you need to add them here. In package.json we have these dependencies and 2 commands to run the storyboard. And the way you were creating a component previously, we were creating a component without thinking that that component will stay independent or will remain independent, but now we need to think in a component way that that component can be used on multiple places, so it should be as independent as possible. So all this information required by a component should be provided from the outside. And in stories, what you can do is you can create a different flavor of a component. So you will view that component as a library, and whenever you want, you can display different flavors of a component. That's one example, and you can create as complex component as you want.
Thank you so much, Zeeshan. In the next class, we will start off with Daniyal, who will cover bit.
Yes,
And then Adil will basically design systems. He will give a presentation on design systems. And in the end, Zeeshan will basically combine Storybook and Bit together. And we will finish off this topic in the next class. Everybody, thank you so much. And Zeeshan, you can go back to your Netflix.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay. Bye bye. Bye bye.